All right, let's look at how Americans were moving around and how people were coming to America in the second half of the 20th century and into the 2000s. First, how people are moving around in America. Something we've mentioned already is the growth of the Sun Belt. So much so that by 1990, the majority of Americans, more than half, live in the Sun Belt. That includes Virginia and the Carolinas, all the way out to California. Now, Alaska and Hawaii probably aren't considered part of the Sun Belt, but they're on here because those are states that also see significant growth at this time. All those gray states are shrinking in terms of proportional population of the United States. This trend, the move to the Sun Belt, starts way back in World War II. It starts when military bases and defense plants are built in the Sun Belt during World War II. And during the Cold War, as military spending increases, we see even more growth in the Sun Belt. As we move into the 60s and 70s, and high-tech firms are founded in places like California and other areas of the Sun Belt, as well as older industries begin moving south for cheaper labor and just an overall better climate, it continues that growth of the Sun Belt. So much so that the trend continues in the 1980s and the 1990s, so that by 1994, New York is no longer the second most populated state in the nation. California is number one, but Texas passes New York in 1994 to become the most popular or second most populated state in the country. Now, throughout this time, all regions of the country are growing in total population, but the South and the West are growing faster than the rest of the country. A good example of this is Phoenix, Arizona. In 1945, Phoenix, Arizona just had a few stoplights, but today it's large enough to support 4 major sports teams. How else are people moving around? Well, another change that's taking place in the Sun Belt and in the Rust Belt and all other areas of the country is that by 2000, 80% of the nation, 4 out of every 5 Americans, either live in the city or in the suburbs. And this is significant because of the differences we see or tend to see between urbanites and suburbanites as compared to those people living in rural areas in small town America. Typically, people living in cities and suburbs have a higher income than small town and rural Americans. They typically have more education than small town rural Americans. But they also deal with higher crime rates in the cities. They deal with longer commutes in terms of distance and time. They deal with more traffic and most importantly, a higher cost of living. Another change in U.S. population is the number of Americans over 65 years old. In 1900, they made up only 4% of our country's population, but that has tripled by 2000, so much so that 12% of our nation is now over 65. And you can attribute this to a lot of things like advances in medicine and some other things we'll talk about here in a moment. The majority of Americans over 65 are women. That means that most elderly Americans are more likely to suffer chronic disease because that's a larger problem for older women. And they're more likely to be living in poverty because women earn less than men during their lifetimes. The oldest Americans, those Americans over 85 years old, are likely living in nursing homes, and they need a disproportionate amount of public health care. On the good side, only 10% of the elderly are living below the poverty line, and 75% of the elderly owned their own home. A lot of this is due to programs like Social Security, which has built-in increases every year to deal with the problem of inflation. Politically, this change to an older America is very important because seniors are much more likely to vote than your average Americans. This makes lobbying groups like the American Association for Retired People, or the AARP, very effective in lobbying for the needs of their constituents for things like health care. Let's talk about immigration now. Immigration reaches record proportions in the 1990s, and that's a direct result of changes from 30 years before. Those changes to the immigration laws in 1965 mean that by the 1990s we have more immigrants coming into our country than ever before. Now, the law change in 1965, the Immigration Act of 65, only slightly increased the total number of immigrants allowed in. The big change it makes is that it's no longer based on nations of origin. Instead, a preference is put on reunifying families and bringing in people that can contribute to the American economy. These changes indirectly lead to 4 times as many people entering the United States by the year 2000. Mainly, these immigrants in recent history are coming from Latin America and Asia. You can see here that in 2005, 50% of the people born outside of the United States that were living in the United States came from Latin America, and 25% came from Asia, while only 15% in 2000 came from Europe. Like many immigrants before them, this group of immigrants are going to settle in urban areas, especially this time, urban areas in California, in Texas, in New York, also Florida, Illinois, and New Jersey. And sometimes immigrants put pressure, as they have in American history, put pressure on public services. And this is really exacerbated. It's the worst during recession. So it's really trying on the public services in these cities in the 1990s, early 1990s, and the early 2000s when our economy is in recession. Now, most studies who have looked at immigration acknowledge that there is a cost in services for things like school and healthcare. But immigrants, as it's been found in most studies, end up being an overall benefit to the United States. Through things like helping consumers and employers. Immigrants are normally, throughout American history, have worked for lower wages. Modern immigrants work typically in restaurant industries, in textiles, in farming, and in construction. However, the people in the economy that are hurt most by increases in education are those low-skilled American-born workers. We're basically talking about high school dropouts, because wages for high school dropouts are low and are going to stay low because immigrants are willing to work for those jobs as well. However, as compared to the Southern and Eastern European immigrants of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and before them, the German and Irish immigrants from the mid 1800s, the U.S. economy has changed today. Immigrants entering the United States today often lack the education to achieve prosperity in this modern economy. So most immigrants will likely remain underclass, will likely remain in poorer economic classes. In 2002, Hispanic immigrants became the largest minority, or Hispanics became the largest minority group in America. And when we talk about Hispanics, we're talking about people we're talking about Mexican Americans, we're talking about Puerto Ricans, we're talking about Cuban Americans, and we're also talking about people from other areas of Central America. As we've stated, Hispanics, along with other immigrants, generally remain concentrated in cities, but Hispanic Americans can be found all over the country. Some other trends that we see is they are typically younger than your average American. They are typically from a larger family than your average American. Hispanics are typically more likely to be in poverty. That's a direct result of receiving 2/3 the pay of white workers. As a result, 25% of Hispanics in the United States are below the poverty line. That's more than double the national average. And that's a direct result of them often only being able to work the lowest paying jobs, manual labor jobs, working as domestic servants, or as we see here, working in agriculture as migrant workers who travel where jobs are available. One thing holding Hispanics back from moving up in economic status is often a lack of education. Hispanics have the highest dropout rate of any minority in the United States. And as Hispanics have become the most common minority in America, that has raised or elevated the debate over undocumented aliens, immigrants who are here illegally. And the arguments are that those illegal immigrants keep wages low, that they take jobs, that they take welfare, that they put a strain on health care and other parts of state and federal budgets. However, the nation benefits from this cheap labor. The nation benefits from having these people that are willing to work jobs where others are not. And also, it's important to remember that even illegal immigrants have to pay sales tax. They pay withholding tax on their wages, even if they're paid under the table. Their employer has taxes that they have to pay, so that's taken out of their paycheck eventually. And for the most part, they don't and can't use most government services like healthcare. And they also don't break the law, because if they did, if they got a speeding ticket, they would probably be deported. So they are very law-abiding people. And again, as we mentioned, employers really benefit from this. They got cheap labor, they didn't have to pay the minimum wage, they weren't joining unions, and they didn't have pensions established for them. Because of this inequity, in 1986, and we learned about this when we looked at Ronald Reagan, Congress passed a law that penalized employers who knowingly hire undocumented aliens. The bill also provided for amnesty to immigrants who had been here since 1982. In other words, that means a path to citizenship was set up for people who might have entered the United States illegally prior to 1982. Even this bill and other immigration reform has not stopped illegal immigration. It continues today, and it is very dangerous for the people that try it. Numerous deaths occur every year, especially across the southern border of the United States.